Hey guys, welcome back to Intelligent Faith 315. This is Pastor Jay. We're going to be continuing on today with part 2 of this lesson, Has Science Eliminated the Need for God? Just going to get right into it. Last time, we spoke about the 5 areas that we're going to be addressing in this lesson. The 5 points that we'll be making over the course of this lesson. Has science eliminated the need for God? Number 1, we're going to be talking about the scientific founding fathers, that these men were largely Christians, theists, and believers in God. Number 2, we'll talk about the idea of scientism, which is very prolific, very popular in academia and the university today. That scientism is the claim that if a truth claim cannot be expressed in the language of science, namely physics or chemistry, then it's literally a meaningless idea, that you can't really accept it and should not believe it. And we'll talk about the claim of scientism is a self-defeating idea. We'll talk about number 3, simple irrelevance, that 95% of science simply has nothing to do with the claims of Christianity. However, there is about 5% of relevant science that does have to do with Christianity and the truth claims of theism, but this 5% strongly supports Christianity and belief in God. So we'll talk about that strong support as number 4. And lastly, number 5, we'll talk about a single perspective. There are many ways to learn truth about reality. Science is a single perspective. And though it is a good perspective, a reliable source of truth about reality, there are many other areas, many other ways that we can and should look for truth about reality. So we're going to be examining these 5 points over the course of our lesson. And as I said, these are 5 reasons that science has not eliminated the need for God. And we're glad you're here. If you disagree with that statement, then we're especially glad you've joined us. If you are an atheist, a humanist, a naturalist, a materialist, and if you're a Christian, well then this is some great tools and resources to equip yourself with in this modern culture of scientism that we happen to find ourselves in. And so last time, we left off on reason number 1 on our scientific founding fathers, that the vast majority of these men, certainly not all of them, but the vast majority of the founders and the pillars, so to say, of the modern scientific enterprise were believers in God and theists. We only got to Plato and Aristotle, and just briefly again, these are 2 men who are some of the greatest intellectual minds of Western civilization. Most people tend to think of Plato and Aristotle as just philosophers, which of course they were, but you have to realize that historically speaking, if you do research on the history of philosophy, and if you want a good book for that, I encourage you to read Frederick Copleston's History of Philosophy series, fantastic. And what you discover is that science, which is just the Latin word scientia, is an outgrowth from philosophy. Science, or scientia, is just one branch that branched off from natural philosophy and has become its own modern discipline. And Plato and Aristotle, some of the greatest philosophers, but of course some of the most earliest scientists, especially Aristotle, and they were both believers in God. As we said last time, a simple quote from Plato, "God is not the author of all things, but of good only." Plato typically referred in his writings, the dialogues, as that God is the good, capital G, the good. And Aristotle says that beauty is the gift from God. And so Aristotle typically referred to God as the demiurgos. And so we left off with these 2 guys. Let's go on to our next thinkers. We have Leonardo da Vinci. And of course, I'm sure you're aware of Mr. Leonardo. He painted the Mona Lisa. As you can see, this prolific artist, inventor, and scientist mentioned in his journals his personal belief in God. And if you know anything about Leonardo da Vinci, he's one of the greatest intellects of his day, a very, very influential man. Interesting to note, though, that as a man of science, he did not find belief in a theistic personal God contradictory, but rather complementary. And so Leonardo da Vinci, this is a quote, he says here, "Disgrace should be represented upside down because all her deeds are contrary to God and they tend to hell." He says, "If the Lord, who is the light of all things, will enlighten me, I will speak of light." And then Leonardo da Vinci says, "I obey thee, Lord, first for the love I ought, in all reason to bear thee, and secondly, for that thou canst shorten or prolong the lives of men." And so Leonardo da Vinci here, being very open about his belief in a personal creator God, but actually referring to him as Lord, speaking of hell and so forth. Fascinating that one of the undoubtedly greatest scientific minds ever is very open in his quotes, his writings, his journals about his belief in a personal creator God. Interesting to see that. Let's go on to another one. Nicholas Copernicus. And if any of you know anything about Nicholas Copernicus, this man was, as you can see here, pretty much responsible for the discovery of what we call heliocentricity. That the sun is obviously in the center of our solar system and that the earth rotates around the sun. We take this for granted, of course, but Nicholas Copernicus and some others, Galileo as well, which we'll mention him, these gentlemen, but primarily Nicholas Copernicus, were responsible for the discovery of heliocentricity, that the helios, the sun, is at the center of our solar system and that the earth rotates around it. And what belief did Nicholas Copernicus hold? Well, we see here that he lived in the 15th and 16th century. This Prussian astronomer was responsible for the discovery of heliocentricity and was a devout follower of Christ. Not just some kind of a general theistic concept, but of Christ personally. He says, I am aware that a philosopher's ideas are not subject to the judgment of ordinary persons. He's speaking of philosopher as natural philosophy or science. He says, because it is his endeavor to seek the truth in all things, to the extent permitted to human reason by God. And so Nicholas Copernicus, if you read his writings, very, very clear believer in Christ, in the Lord, in Christianity, in the Christian faith. And he's very obvious about this and blatant about it in his writings and in his quotes. Interesting what Nicholas Copernicus says here. He says, the philosopher's ideas, it is his endeavor to seek the truth in all things. And just an encouragement, if you're a Christian, we need to be able to demonstrate the truth in all of these things to folks who would ask us. And if you're an atheist, a humanist, a relativist, or a naturalist, I do encourage you, you as well, continue to seek after the truth in all things. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Even if it becomes uncomfortable for you, do a good personal investigation, just like these men did, and you may be surprised at what you find. So anyway, Nicholas Copernicus, one of the greatest scientific minds of the past couple of centuries, and he was an outright blatant believer in a personal theistic God. We also have Galileo Galilei, and you would of course think of him as you think of Nicholas Copernicus. Galileo lived between 1564 and 1642, an Italian scientist and Christian. Galileo is responsible for vast improvements in the telescope, pioneering observational astronomy, and is called by many the father of science and astronomy. And you can see here that he's showing some cardinals in the church of his day through his manufactured telescope here. Galileo says that the Bible shows the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go. That's because some people disagreed with Galileo's findings in support of Copernicus, that the earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. He says, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense and reason and intellect has intended us to forego their use. Mathematics is the language with which God has written the universe. So many of you would believe in that as well. Many of you would say the same thing, that we are supposed to use our intellect and reason and good sense. And you would also agree probably that mathematics is the language with which God has written the universe. But Galileo also believed in that because of his research in science, in astronomy. And he believed that that was all because of a divine intellect, a divine designer behind the cosmos. So there was some church opposition in his day to Galileo, and that's a separate issue, but certainly it doesn't mean that these guys were doing what was right, and it does not negate the fact that Galileo himself, as a scientist, as a great mind, he was a believer in the Christian God and the Christian worldview, and this becomes obvious throughout his writings. I do encourage you to investigate something, and what Galileo says here, that mathematics is the language with which God has written the universe. Dr. William Lane Craig has been speaking recently about what he calls the applicability of mathematics. And if there was no God, if everything was randomly, chaotically, accidentally caused through, let's say perhaps the Big Bang or some kind of a multiverse accidental happening, then mathematics really wouldn't be applicable to the universe. But of course we know that mathematics is applicable to the universe, and it coincides with what we can see in reality, the mathematical equations that Galileo or any other kind of a scientist can draw up on a piece of paper and work out mathematically can and do correspond to reality. And it's an interesting argument for God's existence that mathematics would have no applicability if God did not exist in reality. So I do encourage you to think about that. Let's go on to our next scientist, Dr. Isaac Newton. One of the greatest minds ever to have lived, and of course, before the coming of Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton was the father of physics, what now is commonly referred to as Newtonian physics. So he lived from 1642 to 1727, and this man is just a fascinating intellect. I've heard even many secularist and atheistic thinkers refer to the fact of the great mind and kind of the Renaissance man, multiple disciplines that Isaac Newton excelled in. And so we can see here, perhaps the greatest scientist to ever live. Besides being a dedicated Christian, in his scientific work, Newton described universal gravitation and, of course, his 3 laws of motion. He showed that the motions of the earth and of the celestial bodies are governed by the same set of natural laws. He built the first practical reflecting telescope. He developed a theory of color. As you can see here, he has this prism where light is coming into it and then it's separated into the light spectrum there. So he develops a theory of color based on the observation of a prism. But he also formulated an empirical law of cooling. He studied the speed of sound. And in mathematics, Newton shares the credit for the development of differential and integral calculus. And so it's just undoubtedly obvious what a great mind Isaac Newton is. Certainly just an incredible mind in multiple disciplines of science, but interesting to note, and it's rarely ever mentioned, that Isaac Newton was a dedicated, not just theist, but a dedicated Christian. And so Isaac Newton, one of his many quotes, he says, "Whence arises all that order and beauty which we see in the world? Does it not appear from phenomena that there is an incorporeal, living, intelligent, omnipresent being?" And so Isaac Newton is a very devout follower of Christ, of the Christian worldview. As a matter of fact, Isaac Newton even wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, believe it or not. And I also believe on the book of Daniel. And so if you are a person of science, you probably have some great respect for Isaac Newton. But you have to realize that Isaac Newton saw no contradiction between his following of Scripture and his following of science. He saw no chasm in between a belief in God and a study of the physical world. Rather, men like Isaac Newton, they saw their study of the physical world as a window into the mechanics of how God, this divine intellect and designer of the universe, put it all into motion, and how he has orchestrated it and the mechanics that he's used. So in studying science, these men were, in a sense, discovering the mind of God. And this is how Isaac Newton and men like him would phrase that. So Isaac Newton, also a great founding father of modern science, and also a definite believer in the Christian worldview and a follower of Christ. We also have Louis Pasteur. He's one of my favorites. Louis Pasteur, as many of you know, he is the father of bacteriology and germ theory. And so Louis Pasteur here, he lived from 1822 to 1895. And if you didn't know this, which perhaps you may, Louis Pasteur in his day soundly defeated the theory of spontaneous generation. Most of you would perhaps know, or you could research, his experiment with these curved shaped glass tubes, and it was commonly thought in his day that unliving matter spontaneously generated and came to life because they were not aware of bacteria and these microscopic organisms. So if you left soup out on the table for multiple days, it would grow mold, and they perceived that as the non-living chemicals and materials spontaneously coming to life. And Louis Pasteur is very famous for the experiments that he performed, soundly disproving spontaneous generation in his day. This is, of course, very important because around the time of his death, I believe, I think around 1895, Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species came out, and of course, the belief in spontaneous generation is a part of modern evolutionary theory, but it's interesting to note that Louis Pasteur soundly disproved it. This French scientist is credited as being the father of modern medicine, as well as the father of bacteriology, the study of bacteria, as we said, as well as having discovered the pasteurization process and developing germ theory. So when you go to the grocery store and the milk that you purchase it's called pasteurized milk, it's because Louis Pasteur developed the pasteurization process for the safeguarding of milk. And so Louis Pasteur, one of his quotes, he says, "When one works and imagines and dreams of nothing else and searches for the answers that God has posed, it is difficult to be so still." He says, "Science brings men nearer to God." Science brings men nearer to God. An amazing claim by one of the greatest scientists of his day, and a man who is still referred to as the father of bacteriology and one of the fathers of modern science. And again, Louis Pasteur often spoke about the search for answers that God has posed. It's hard to be so still because there's so much he wanted to discover about the natural world, highlighting God's existence and understanding how God did it, how God has designed and constructed this beautiful universe that we inhabit. So Louis Pasteur, father of bacteriology and the father of modern medicine, he makes the claim that science brings men nearer to God. And that also is the claim that we make as well, that the true pursuit of science does bring men nearer to God, not farther away. We'll leave it there for today. We'll continue on next time talking about the modern fathers of the scientific movement. Hopefully you'll come back and join us for our next video.